Hello, welcome to the Yoga Lawyer Show. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about
Spring.
spring.
Spring has sprung.
Spring has sprung.
Mercury in retrograde. What
Yes.
the heck does that mean?
What does that mean? And then also we've got the March for Our Lives coming up this weekend, so we thought we'd talk a little bit more about that, continue the conversations we've been having about guns and mass shootings in America.
Yeah, this one's going to be interesting. We're going to talk about mental illness and what that kind of means too for gun violence.
We hear that a lot with guns. You know, you hear it kind of depends what side you're on. Like a lot of times you'll hear the more gun advocating type of folks say this isn't a gun issue, it's a mental health issue, and then people on the anti-gun side have a different perspective on it. And as always, things are somewhere in between. It's not so clear cut to say that it's a mental issue versus a gun issue. We can get into some of the stats and really look at that.
Yeah, but first let's talk about spring.
So, yes, it's spring this week. March 21st was the first day of spring. I believe it was the 21st yesterday.
I think so.
And then tomorrow, Mercury goes into retrograde. And that's always an interesting time because sometimes, we were saying even people that don't necessarily think about astrology on a day-to-day basis may even be familiar with Mercury in retrograde.
Or at least heard of it.
You've heard of it.
Because I didn't really understand it, but I had heard of it. So maybe you could explain
Yes,
it.
so, just to kind of understand what happens when Mercury is in retrograde, the basic gist of it is that, Mercury is a smaller planet closer to the sun than the Earth, so what takes the Earth 1 year to go around the sun, Mercury does I think about 3 or 4 laps. So usually about 3 or 4 times a year in our path around the sun, Mercury passes us because it goes around the sun more quickly than we do. And when that happens, when Mercury is passing us and we're kind of in line with Mercury and the sun, it's said that Mercury's in retrograde. And one way to think about it is it's sort of the same phenomenon if you're driving down the highway and a big tractor trailer comes up beside you, and for a moment it feels like your car is traveling backwards. It's kind of the same effect when Mercury passes the Earth. For a minute it feels like the Earth is going backwards, and that it's not like we feel that the Earth is going backwards, but symbolically, metaphorically, the type of things that Mercury is said to control in our lives can feel like they're going backwards. And humans throughout time have associated the planet Mercury with certain characteristics. So it's kind of in our stories, it's in our culture, it's in our mythology.
And it's not like a 1 minute or like a 1 day thing. It's like a couple weeks long.
3 weeks is when it happens. That's the period that Mercury's in retrograde. So Mercury, was always seen as like the messenger god. So Mercury controls communication, travel. And during the time that Mercury's in retrograde, those things can be affected.
So what does that mean for like your day-to-day life?
Well, for your day-to-day life, I mean, honestly, I think of it more as like, let's not get too wrapped up in, the superstition of it and use it as a time to look inward, because that's really what it's about. It's, it's a time to slow down, because it's a time to kind of look backward and reflect. So areas of our lives like relationships, communication, travel, those things we can expect that there might be some backward movement. So rather than getting frustrated or caught up in what seems like problems in our lives that happen during this period, we can use it as a time to look inward, reflect. It's a good time to reconnect with old friends. It's a good time to clean out the closets, that type of thing. It kind of goes hand in hand with spring, so it's nice that we have spring and Mercury's in retrograde at the same time. It's a good time to do some spring cleaning, and then when Mercury goes direct in 3 weeks, it will feel like a breath of fresh air. That's when I think we'll really feel spring. I'll be like, spring.
Spring is finally spring.
But it's interesting how these stories that humans have, like our stories about Mercury and the mythology that's been with us for ages. I think it does affect us, like whether you agree that maybe there's a literal effect or whether it's a figurative effect. I mean, that's kind of up to you. But it's still a good time to explore your own inner space. So we'd like to hear if you have thoughts on it. Feel free to comment.
You're like, oh, that's crazy.
I mean, I notice, it does seem like electronics tend to be a little screwy, and
I like to blame all of my electronic problems on it.
It's a good time to just blame Mercury for everything. So if anything goes wrong during this 3-week period, you can
It went
blame
straight
Mercury.
to my junk email, Mercury.
Yeah, exactly.
Mercury.
but on a larger perspective, it's not crazy to think that these large planetary bodies would have some kind of influence on us. But I have friends that are, astronomers who are like, yeah, it doesn't really, the gravitational pull isn't enough to affect you. And I'm like, but it's the stories, it's our culture that it does have an effect.
We're made of stars.
We're made of stardust.
They are us.
It affects us. So we won't judge either way, whether you're a believer or not. But I think regardless, it's a good time to look inward. As always, the yogi in me says, look inward. Find your own areas where you can do some spring cleaning to grow.
It would be a better time to say that it is the beginning of spring.
Yeah.
Rather than just picking an arbitrary date. Like, why March 21st? Why is that the first day
I
of
think
spring?
there must be something, because it's not, is it the same day every year on our calendar? Because then that's when I would be suspicious. If it's like every year on a certain day, then, it doesn't
Easter's
have...
not the same
No,
day.
it changes. And so does Mercury goes retrograde or direct in different days.
Very strange. So strange.
But anyway, back to guns, because that's what we wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah. That's what you're here for.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about that mental health issue. I think Katie started to mention it.
Yeah. Because we got a comment.
Yeah, we get a lot of comments.
I've been posting a lot of things on Facebook, just different perspectives on guns and different articles with different statistics, just to kind of, you want to have as much knowledge as you can on the issue, just so if you do get into a conversation with somebody who might have an opposing opinion, you can at least be knowledgeable of your side or their side, or just knowledgeable.
Or you might
in
change your
general.
mind too. It's always good to...
So I've just been posting a lot of stuff, which obviously is controversial, and we get comments. And one of our comments, they basically phrased, they tried to assert that it wasn't a gun issue, it was a mental health issue, which I personally think is kind of a cheap cop-out. Because what is a mental health issue, first of all? There's different definitions, I read an article where they were saying, a psychologist was basically saying that mental illness, the definition of a mental illness changes over time. As the DSM-5, which is, it's like this big...
the big medical book that's got
right.
all the conditions coded.
As it's updated, they change the definitions, and it changes with time, with society. So mental illness, the definition of mental illness changes. Something that could have been considered mental illness prior is not considered that now. And mental illness is not a lifelong thing. You can be mentally ill for certain periods of your life and then not be mentally ill. And there were situations where I forget the mass shooting or the school shooting, which one it was, which is terrible.
There's been so many that it's hard to sometimes distinguish between them.
But I guess the shooter went in and talked to a counselor, and the counselor cleared him and said he didn't have a mental health issue.
Well, that's that's what you're going to get into. And I feel like, just to, play devil's advocate a little bit, is I don't understand where people are coming from when they say this is a mental health issue and not a gun issue, because, as humans, we think, we go off, someone's going to shoot up a school, they've got to have something wrong with them. That makes sense.
Insane.
But it's too simplistic to say this is a mental health issue, or even to say this is a gun issue. It's a big issue that involves lots of things. But to try to pick, well, I think it's a mental health issue, not a gun issue, that ignores a broad range of statistics, which clearly suggests that there's a link between guns and gun violence. And that same link doesn't exist with mental health issues.
It does exist, but it's so minor.
It does exist. That's a good point. It is, so that there is mental health is part of the issue, but it doesn't,
but it's not the overwhelming factor.
Well, even, we could say that about guns too, I guess. But so we hate to, we're not trying to pick which issue is the most important. But it is interesting to look at the mental health issue. I know you had some stats on it, Katie, you wanted to talk a little bit about. The big one, if I could lead in, is that people that have a mental health issue are much more likely to be victims of violence instead of committing violent acts. And that's across the board statistically. So
yes.
You want to be careful blaming issues like this on mental health, when statistically, if you have a mental health problem, you're much more likely to be a victim than to victimize. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a link at all, and that you had some of the statistics on that, right?
I also feel like blaming mental health is it makes you feel better if you are the victim, or maybe you're like related to the victim or have some sort of connection
Like it
to
has
the
a
victim.
reason that it happened type of thing? Like,
it's easy for you to say like, oh, they were crazy. Of course they did this, because you can kind of like put a solid reason.
and
rather than
separate themselves from you too. Well, I'm not, I wouldn't do it because I am not mentally.
But it's
like
also the reverse. Say you do have a mental health issue. That could be anything. It could be depression. And
Yeah,
then there's
a lot of people do.
politicians and your family, your friends are saying, no, it's not guns, it's a mental health issue. And you're like, hey, I'm a mental health issue.
And I'm not.
I'm not going to kill someone, but like,
Yeah.
it's kind of hard. So yeah, I did some research, and there are several other factors that are more predictive of violent action than mental illness. So some factors from a series of studies, I can post the link.
Pretty cool.
A series of studies of different amounts of people, different sects of the population, different areas, different times, different age groups. It's all diverse. They found that there were several other factors that had a bigger impact on whether or not a person would commit a violent act. So some of the big factors were whether they were male or female. Males were obviously more likely. That statistically they found, and there are more males in the
world?
I think so.
Maybe
like
like
a little bit.
0.5% more.
But that's like a little give me like, not guys, it's not all guys. We're not just trying to say. Anyway, if you're poor, you're more likely. If you have had some history with alcohol or drugs, whether it's use or abuse, doesn't matter. If you are just like an everyday.
And this is just statistical correlation. It doesn't mean poor people are more violent. It just means when you look at it and you chart statistically, like demographically, where it is violent. And there could be a lot of other reasons or factors that go into why poverty tends to be an indicator.
Yeah, we're not trying to say that if you're a poor man, you're going to kill someone. We're not trying to say that. But statistically,
there's a higher incidence of violent crimes among those groups. That's all that means.
And another one that I thought was really interesting was people who had previous violent victimization. So if you had already been a victim of a violent act, you were more likely to
go out yourself and
yes.
commit a violent act. That's where, as a society, we could really help by, just fostering that sense of community and helping people that feel separate.
And this psychologist who did all of these studies found that mental illness was a factor, but these other factors were more predictive of violent behavior. And the way that he did the study was he would ask people all of these demographic questions and then try to decide if they were going to commit a violent act based on,
predict it. How did that work out?
Okay, it was a study of all of the different homicides.
Okay.
And he would look at the homicide and just read about the people and ask like, okay, what were their demographic situation, and then try to predict. And he said that their mental illness, their state of mental illness, was not predictive, especially for females. If you were a woman, it was almost like a complete chance. Yeah. I also found that suicide was more common than homicide. So
as far as gun violence goes, when you look at the gun, that's the same thing. We talked a little bit about this. I don't know if it was last week or the week before, about how mass shootings are such a small subset of gun violence, and then homicide is a small subset of gun violence too. Compared to, there's a lot more suicides than homicides.
That might play into your statistic about mentally ill people being more likely to be victims.
Because if they're killing themselves, they're victimizing themselves.
They're more likely to kill themselves.
And we have to be careful, because when you talk about mental health, it's like there's a clinical definition, like you were saying, the charts in the book. So you can't just say, oh, it's a mental health issue, because there's a clinical definition of what a mental health issue is, and not everybody that's committing horrible acts has any kind of mental health issue. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a mental health issue just because they're doing something we would perceive as crazy.
Yeah, and from a legal standpoint, maybe you could talk about this. Claiming insanity is so hard to prove.
Well, yeah, that's the thing too. I was telling Katie before we started filming, I remember, as like a preteen, and I was always interested in the law and thinking, just looking at criminal law and thinking about how, you could argue that anybody that commits a horrible crime like murder is insane. Now, are they legally insane? No, they're not. But I remember thinking, wow, but to commit murder, you have to be kind of crazy. And that's a complete difference than claiming insanity. That's like a whole other issue. But yeah, to prove legal insanity is different than just saying, well, I think you got to be crazy to kill somebody. So where does that leave us?
I think that we should be careful with the kind of assertions that we make. I mean, it's not fair to have all of these grand opinions about things that we don't really understand. Like, I don't really understand what a mental health issue is.
That's a good point. So when we say things like that, we should look into it a little more, do a little research, and think about what our words mean.
And then also, I don't know, just being open to talking to people about it, because your idea of a mental health issue might be different than somebody else's idea. So explaining yourself and being open to
There's definitely a problem. Like, I think the people that are saying it's a mental health issue are, going, there's something wrong. We need to maybe help them or do something as a society so that we're not breeding these killers. And to, maybe mental health isn't the right way to phrase it because of
public health initiatives should be bipartisan.
Yeah, and public health this is a public health issue. Gun violence is a public health issue. It's something that the CDC should be looking at. That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down because they haven't been allowed to.
Oh yeah. But also, if you want to claim that it's not gun violence, it's mental health that's the problem, well, what's the fix?
Yeah.
Do we have public health initiatives that force treatment on people that are said to have mental health issues?
I don't know. I mean, I think we need to look at, as a society, having happier individuals who are, more comfortable in themselves and feel like they're members of a whole, not that they're not isolated and separate, and that is part of the issue. From my perspective, I'm like, yeah, that's a big part of the issue. I mean, we see these the mass shooters tend to be isolated males. So there's something there, but to call it a mental health issue might not be the right way to say it, because as we know, statistically, if you have mental health problems, you're more likely to be a victim of crime than to be the one victimizing.
And it's not fair to discount the problem of gun violence by saying that it's a
No,
mental
that's
health
true. Because
issue.
if you look at the statistics, gun violence is a big issue. We posted all kinds of stats on this, but clearly there's a link between an increase in the amount of guns and gun violence. Now, as a society, we might be okay with that because we believe strongly in the Second Amendment, but there's still got to be a common ground, and I know we've talked about this at length. But yeah, there's common ground because I think everybody would agree. Gun advocates, people against guns, everybody wants to keep guns out of people that aren't mentally capable of having them, non-law-abiding citizens. We all agree that there should be certain groups of people that aren't allowed to have guns, and to do that we need better regulations. It doesn't mean that the people that are law-abiding citizens shouldn't have guns. They should have them. That's great. You're a law-abiding citizen, and as a law-abiding citizen you should want tougher restrictions to keep the guns out of the bad guys' hands. And part of those restrictions can be, I like the idea of testing, sort of like driver's license, that type of thing, but I don't know where that might lead us.
Yeah.
We'll have to see.
So basically, mental health is definitely an issue, but so is gun control. And I think we need to look at both.
Yes, and other things too. Let's look at
Yes.
everything.
All of the things.
Because this is a problem and we want to fix it. Everybody wants to fix it. There's not anybody in America who's like,
We're
screw
fine.
it. No, we want to fix it, and trying to, blame each problem, maybe that's not the right way to do it. We've got to look at a cohesive solution that comes from many different angles. There's not going to be a simple solution, unfortunately. But we could end it there today. Hopefully we'll see you at the march. I think we're planning to go, and maybe we'll catch some video. I'd like to get a little video of the walk at Lake Eola. We're going to go to the one local. So maybe we'll see you there. But leave comments, as always. Leave us feedback, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching the Yoga Lawyer video.